Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you as ever to the organisers for putting together a very varied and well-run conference. And thank you to all of you for your patience in allowing me to present in English, which really is too kind, and I will try to be as clear as possible, as you said. So, what I'm going to present today really comes from the context of my PhD research, as we've been told, on Thyestes' tragedies before Seneca. Thank you. So, usually for me, these include the fragmentary tragedies of Euripides, of Sophocles, but also of the Republican tragedians Ennius and Accius. The methodology becomes quite different when we start to work with Republican fragments, because as we know, there is no entirely excellent paradigm from which to work. So when I work with Euripides or Sophocles, I can use the surviving plays to create a framework for how I think the fragments would have fitted in the context of Euripides' Thyestes or Sophocles' Thyestes. When turning to Ennius and Accius, however, I need to look more closely at where the fragments are quoted and the context in which they appear. Really, to access Ennius and Accius, as we've been told this morning, we need to understand the context in which they're presented. Typically, this comes down to us through Cicero. It's almost impossible to read Republican tragedy, therefore, without reading a reception study of the Republican fragments, without understanding how Cicero uses these fragments to illustrate a particular point, a particular line of argument, and what's more, to present them differently in the different texts he's writing in each moment. We're not just looking at the fragments through Cicero's eyes, we're looking at them in the context of, as we've indicated, a philosophical discourse, a rhetorical discourse, and as we'll explore later, in the letters and the epistolary works of Cicero as well. Okay, so when looking at Ennius and Accius in particular, we can help ourselves to differentiate between the two, because they pick up on different points in the Thyestes story. So if I just draw your attention to point 1 on your handout, and hopefully there will be an Italian version of the handout to help you through, we see the story of Thyestes. So, point 1, Pelops' son Atreus ascends the throne and fathers Agamemnon and Menelaus by Aerope. Aerope then maintains an affair with Thyestes, bearing illegitimate children to him and giving him the golden fleece, the royal token that will allow him to usurp Atreus. So far, so familiar. I think we talked about this a little bit with Eleni when we were looking at Cressae, Euripides' Cressae. This affair leads to Atreus' revenge feast, the Thyestean Cena, which is really at the heart of my research, in which Atreus kills Thyestes' illegitimate children and feeds them to him, resulting in the reversal of the stars. Some attest that the stars reverted their course following Thyestes' claim to the throne and returned to their proper course following the banquet, so there's a variant in the tradition. Now, the Thyestean Cena, the feast, is the story that Accius follows in his Atreus. And we have an indication of this because in fragments 163 to 6 in Rubik, we have a clear plotting of a cannibalistic feast. You may also be familiar with the very famous maxim from Accius Atreus, Odorint dum metuant, let them hate me so long as they fear me, and we have this build-up to the feast with Atreus. Ennius picks up on a different part of the myth. For Ennius Thyestes, the myth is really focused on what happens after the feast, when Thyestes has left Mycenae and when he has gone to Sicyon and he meets King Thesprotus. In this part of the story, Thyestes rapes his daughter Pelopeia in order to father his avenging son Aegisthus, who will avenge Atreus, will avenge the feast of the children. So, fortunately, we have some help in the fragments to differentiate the two episodes of the myth. So when we're presented with a Republican fragment, we can hopefully fit them into the different narratives of Ennius, Thyestes, and Accius, Atreus. The tradition overall looks a little bit like this, so I've put some very approximate dates on the PowerPoint for you. So Ennius Thyestes seems to have appeared first, followed by Accius Atreus. Later on this morning we'll talk a little bit about Pomponius Bononesis Atreus, which is a potential farce, so potential comic take on this myth, believe it or not. And in the middle of this tradition before Seneca, we meet with Cicero's De Inventione, Natura Deorum, and Letters to Friends, which will be the focus of the text today. Just to give you an idea then, before we come to the fragments themselves, of how reliant we are on Cicero, particularly for the Thyestes fragments. According to the fragments that are securely attributed by Ribbick, the fragments we're comfortable with and we would work with from Ribbick's Tragicorum Romanorum, 3 of the 4 fragments we have of Ennius Thyestes come from Cicero. 13 of the 20 fragments of Accius Atreus that we have come from Cicero. So it's really crucial for me to keep going back to Cicero's works and seeing how he uses the fragments that are secure, and hopefully today how we can use Cicero's context to attribute fragments that are not secure, that are not accepted as part of Accius Atreus on the one hand, or Ennius Thyestes on the other. Okay, so when we come to Natura Deorum on point 2 of your handout, we're in Cicero's philosophical dialogue. It's a 3-book dialogue written 45 BC, and here Cicero introduces the fragment in the context of a discourse on justice and what it means to be just, what it means to be right. So Cicero introduces the fragment on your handout as such. Would any state tolerate the movement of a law of that kind in which it would be ordained or permitted for a son or a grandson to be condemned for the wrongdoing of a father or a grandfather? A very familiar theme of ancestral guilt that we've talked about already so far. So, this fragment is very comfortably attributed to Accius because we have some help in the transmitted text. We have a clear reference to Accius in Servius's discourse alongside the Aeneid. So in Servius's commentary on the Aeneid, this fragment is given to Accius. What we don't have is a clear understanding of which Accius drama this would come from. So, if we go to the editors, we see Renaud Gagne in Ancestral Font in Ancient Greece, attribute this to Accius. Ribbick attributes this to Accius, but not to Atreus. He puts it in the uncertain tragedies. He's not sure which story this would fall in line with. And if we look at Warmington, the remains of Old Latin in the Low, he offers up 3 different possible plays from which this fragment could be taken. So Warmington puts forward the possibility of Accius's Oinomaeus, Accius's Pelopidae, and Accius Atreus. If we work through Warmington's suggestion, using a process of elimination by looking at the stories of each Accius play, we can hopefully see that this fragment might best suit Accius Atreus. Taking the Oinomaeus first then, we've talked a little bit about the Oinomaeus story this morning and how Pelops enters into a chariot race to woo and to win Thyestes' mother Hippodamia from her father Oinomaeus. Now, in this play, the death of Myrtilus, who is Oinomaeus' charioteer, would possibly feature. However, it would be a very recent event in the play. So when we look at the fragment in front of us, when we look at the fragment on point 2, where shall the Tantalus vendetta end? What penalty for Myrtilus' murder shall ever glut the appetite of vengeance? We're looking at a very recent crime, and a crime that's not necessarily framed as a feature of ancestral guilt, because at the end of the Oinomaeus tragedy, Pelops is successful. He's not punished, he seems to be prospering. He's won Hippodamia, and actually things seem to be going pretty well for him. When we turn to Pelopidae, another of Warmington's suggestions, we have a very unusual narrative here. So in Pelopidae, or Children of Pelops, this seems to be a narrative in which Chrysippus features. Chrysippus is an unusual character because we're used to seeing him in the Greek tradition as the lover of King Laius. He's typically abducted by Laius. However, after the Hellenistic period, Chrysippus features as the half-brother of Atreus and Thyestes. And in this narrative, we have fragments in the Pelopidae, for example, of Hippodamia, who's very concerned about this half-brother, and who asks Atreus and Thyestes to kill Chrysippus and secure their ascent to the throne. So, it's not necessarily alluding to ancestral guilt in the same way. The murder is very tactical. And again, at the end of Pelopidae, Atreus and Thyestes have secured their ascent to the throne. The outcome is particularly good, despite the tragic circumstances. So when we consider the motif not only of ancestral guilt, but how it functions as a kind of justice, which is the way that Cicero presents it to us as a kind of perverse justice, it seems that this fragment best fits Atreus. It's in Atreus that we've seen the initial crime of Thyestes, seducing Aerope, and it's in Atreus that we see the perverted justice of the cannibalistic feast. The themes are perhaps best expressed by this narrative, and the allusion in the patronymic to Tantalus is perhaps best expressed in a play that deals with transgressive feasting. As we all remember Tantalus in the Latin tradition for having cut up his son Pelops and fed him to the gods. So the recurring motifs of feasting and the recurring motifs of ancestral guilt are perhaps most pertinent to Accius Atreus as opposed to Pelopidite and Oenomaus. It's particularly important to try and attribute these fragments because they give us a new insight and shed new light on the fragments of Accius Atreus. Typically, when we meet these fragments, they occur in political discourses, and that perhaps misrepresents the play because we focus on it through a very political framework. The odorant Dometuant maxim is very famous because it recurs in Seneca de Ira, Seneca Clementia. It comes up in Suetonius when Suetonius describes the emperors, and therefore we get the impression that these plays are heavily political. However, if we could help attribute the unattributed fragments, we might get a fuller understanding of a variety of themes in these plays beyond the political focus. Turning our attention then to Ennius Thyestes, and this would be point 3 on your handout. Pardon me. We're in De Inventione, so we're taking a shift here from the philosophical discourse to a discourse on rhetoric and how to make an effective argument. Now, this argument that is presented about the gods is framed as ridiculous when Cicero introduces it in De Inventione. So, Cicero introduces the fragment on point 3 as such. A controvertible argument is one in which a dubious reason is given to prove a dubious case. It's something unbelievable, it seems, and this seems to come through in the fragment. See you, the gods, who own the power and movement of such things above and below, make peace among themselves and create concord. We all, I suppose, have read enough tragedy to understand that this is an unrealistic expectation, and we've had demonstrated to us this morning the gods creating discord and the gods inciting madness and not actually achieving the concord put forward in this fragment. Again, we have a little bit of help from the textual tradition. So, in the Rhetorica ad Herennium, the pseudo-Cicero guidebook to rhetoric, this fragment is attributed very clearly to Ennius. But again, we have this problem. Which Ennius play would this fragment come from? And as usual, when looking at fragments and when looking at these textual traditions, nothing's ever easy. And we have a textual corruption that presents two possibilities for the fragment. So in the Rhetorica ad Herennium, we see this. For in this manner does Ennius stage cresfontem or thesfrontem, as making use of this example on his own authority, as if he had proved it by really convincing arguments. So the Rhetorica ad Herennium positions this fragment either in a play regarding Thesprotus, the king of Sicyon, or in a play based on Cresphontes, based on a different myth altogether. But perhaps then we can learn a little bit more about the plot by looking at the problems with the manuscripts themselves. Marx puts forward in his edition of the fragments that the 12th and 13th century manuscripts of the Rhetorica ad Herennium suggest Thesfrontem. The 9th and 10th century manuscripts suggest Thesfrontum, slightly different spelling, same myth.